Our public has no real concept of how ugly it's going to be after a 9.0 Cascadia quake.
We're in probably one of the most dangerous places in Oregon to have schools.
How will Oregon survive a major earthquake? A quake that could be as bad as what Japan experienced in 2011, or worse.
The subduction zone earthquake is going to stretch from California to the middle of British Columbia. It's just big.
So that one just got turned red.
Is there any worse soil in Portland than we could have built on?
Collapse, partial collapse.
This is the elephant in the room.
People will be on their own for more than just 3 days, in some cases up to 2 weeks, if not longer.
If there is so much that we have to fix, if we have too much damage, we risk never recovering.
Scientists say it's coming, but what can we do to prepare?
We have to take responsibility for this.
How can we build smarter? And what can we learn from earthquakes elsewhere?
When I drive through Japan and I see all of the bridges and overpasses, I see something that's up and running and standing.
Japan is a great example of how an earthquake like this, as bad as it is survivable. And to just throw up your hands and say we're all going to die is wrong.
There was just an enormous earthquake here in Cataclysmic. It is approximately 3:49 at night, or in the morning, I would say.
Get on paved road! Stop!
And we are driving away to high ground because of tsunamis.
Up, Sutton!
And
we are fine. Take a deep breath.
We're all right, but
the moment you realize it's an earthquake, it's true terror. And it's very unclear what you're supposed to do. And you're probably going to do all the wrong things. And we probably did all the wrong things, but all we knew is we had to get the kids out.
The earthquake Kate Raphael's family endured was one of the strongest quakes in history. Within minutes, 750,000 people were left without a home. Kate saw schools, bridges, hospitals, and roads turn to ruins. Kate and her family survived. And today, they live in Portland, Oregon, where an earthquake as large as what they experienced in Chile could strike at any moment.
I think about it all the time. There's a catch-22 to having been in an earthquake, and that is you know how terrible it is, and you know exactly what you need to do to be ready if it happens again. But it's so traumatic that I'm in denial. Okay, bye. If it were to happen today, if it were to happen now, what would I do? See, if I think about that, I start to cry.
Like Kate, many Oregonians aren't prepared. What if a quake strikes while kids are in school? What if your town's only hospital lies in the path of a tsunami? Or if the bridge you take to work collapses, separating you from your family? What would it take to get ready now that scientists tell us Oregon is due for an earthquake as large as any the planet has seen?
We've been making these measurements for about 20 years now, and this is giving us a much better picture of where the strain is building up in the crust.
At Whalen Island near Pacific City, Rob McCaffrey has come to measure what our eyes can't see.
What we have here is a GPS unit.
Rob is tracking the movement of the Earth's crust day by day, year after year. He's tracking the strain building up beneath Oregon. It's the kind of thing that happens before every big quake.
We have several hundred of these marks around Oregon and Washington, and looking at the relative motion between them, we can tell the strain that's building up towards the next earthquake. So for example, this site is moving almost a ½ inch a year towards Portland. Portland's moving only a fraction of that amount. And so there's a squeezing between here and Portland, and that squeezing is like the loading of a spring. Eventually, this whole area will spring back.
The Northwest is no stranger to earthquakes. Klamath Falls, Loma Prieta, Nisqually. Those were strong quakes, but the damage was focused like a bullseye around single epicenters. Rob says we're headed for something far more powerful. Its source, the Cascadia subduction zone. Cascadia is part of the Pacific Ring of Fire, home to the world's most active volcanoes and quakes. Since 2004, 3 major regions of the Pacific Ring of Fire have been hit by quakes greater than magnitude 8. A 4th region, the Cascadia subduction zone, runs more than 600 miles along the northwest coast. It's here where strain is building up as the Juan de Fuca plate struggles to push beneath the North American plate. When it releases, it will trigger a region-wide earthquake that will shake for up to 5 minutes, followed by a tsunami that will wreak havoc along the entire northwest coast. Geologists spent over 30 years piecing together a history of these megaquakes. Their conclusion? Cascadia has unleashed a magnitude 8 or greater quake every 244 years on average. And the last one was more than 300 years ago. Oregon doesn't have to imagine what the next great earthquake will look like. Japan's Tohoku earthquake of 2011 gives us a good idea. The tsunami that followed scraped entire towns off the earth. Dr. Chris Goldfinger has been researching subduction zone earthquakes for over 30 years. He says it's only a matter of chance that Japan, not Oregon, got hit this time.
This was all full of houses. Now it's just nothing but debris piles, 5-foot-tall weeds. Northeast Japan is really a mirror image to our subduction zone in Oregon. And so the energy of the earthquake, a magnitude 9, the size of the tsunami, all of those things are much the same. And a place like this, you can parallel this to some place like Tillamook, for example, a small town in a coastal plain where a tsunami there would sweep well inland. This is an example of, unfortunately, what Oregon has to look forward to in the future.
Japan's hardest hit areas are still recovering several years later. Chris came here to get another look at the causes and consequences of the Tohoku quake. He is joined by Jay Wilson and Allison Perch. Allison is a geotechnical engineer who's come to see how bridges and hospitals stood up to one of the worst earthquakes on Earth. Jay is here as Oregon's seismic chairman on a quest to use Japan's experience to help Oregon plan for its own future disaster.
The fact that there's just a complete absence of any neighborhood here that was a thriving community 3 years ago, there's a lot of heavy implications for us to think about.
It is our responsibility as Oregonians, knowing that this is coming, to take this lesson and to start to move forward. It really affected me a lot here and in Chile when I came into these tsunami zones and saw it.
The tsunami in Japan killed over 15,000 people. The Fukushima nuclear meltdown only added to the tragedy. But outside of Fukushima and the tsunami zones, Japan bounced back relatively quickly. Chris says Oregon wouldn't fare as well.
As bad as this is, and as hard as it is to look into somebody's living room with dishes and shoes on the floor and things like that, Japan could be considered a success story in a lot of ways. So in Sumatra, we lost 250,000 people in a similar-sized earthquake, similar-sized tsunami. Japan, on the other hand, was extremely well prepared. This house is gone, but right over there, the bridge is still operating. Right behind us, there's a paper mill that's running. The port is operating. In Oregon, we're at a bit of a crossroads. We're completely unprepared, and we can go down the route of Indonesia and just let it happen, or we can actually learn something from Japan. We're a wealthy country. We can afford success.
So next up, we have the Oregon Resilience Task Force recommendations pursuant to Senate Bill 33.
Oregon is not prepared, and efforts to get ahead of Cascadia are just beginning.
Many of the buildings, the pipelines, the wires, the facilities were built before we even knew of this risk.
Oregon's resilience plan, put out in 2013, spells out what Oregon could face. 1,000 bridges destroyed. A year without water and sewer in Portland and Salem. 3 years for the coast. 1,000 schools in ruins. The report puts it bluntly, calling Cascadia an unprecedented catastrophe, not just for Oregon, but for the United States. The challenge for Jay is helping Oregon decide what we should do next.
The Oregon Resilience Plan was developed to put a big slab of paper and plans and recommendations right in front of the legislature and say, this is important. This is the elephant in the room that we've been talking about, and we can't let this go.
Yumei Wang is a geotechnical engineer. When she was asked by the Seismic Commission to find Oregon's Achilles heel, she came here.
There are 3 petrochemical facilities here. Each one of them has dock that comes out from the shore.
This stretch of Willamette Riverbank in Portland is home to what Yumei calls the tank farm.
So this area provides fuel for 90–95% of the state of Oregon.
After an earthquake, fuel will be needed for emergency vehicles, fire trucks, airplanes, and generators. Other states have multiple fuel depots. Oregon has one. But Yumei sees an even bigger problem.
Is there any worse soil in Portland than we could have built on?
No one knew about earthquake risks when industry first eyed Portland's waterfront in the early 1900s.
If you look at the old historic maps, you can see that Giles Lake was here. And you can see old photos where the river came into this area, and then they filled it.
Oil and gas companies quickly laid claim to the new land and similar lands up and down the Willamette, eventually building an entire energy complex on dredge spoils. Some of the tanks you see today are nearly 100 years old, and they're still in use. During a big earthquake, Yumei says the soil propping the tanks up could turn to pudding through something called liquefaction.
You need 3 ingredients for liquefaction. You need earthquake shaking, loose sandy soils, and those soils need to be under the water table. We went on all the facilities, and I went and tested it, but there was a lot of this same type of soil under all of the tank farms.
Much of the damage sustained during earthquakes in Chile, New Zealand, and Japan was caused by liquefaction. With just a few minutes of shaking, streets warped, homes toppled, and docks and ports sunk. In places, liquefaction brought down entire city blocks. But what if it happens under tanks filled with millions of gallons of fuel?
The risk here is extreme. Within 10, 20 seconds, the sand will turn into a thick, sandy soup. The slope that we're looking at will start moving out towards the water. The tanks will start to tilt and start moving out in the direction the ground is moving.
Since identifying the problem for the Seismic Commission, UME has focused on what can be done.
You can improve the ground by strengthening it. You can put in grout, you can densify the soil by putting in stone columns. It's always easier to do this ground improvement before you've built, but it can certainly be done after the fact.
This kind of engineering could keep the tanks from collapsing, but neither state nor federal law requires it. We asked companies if they voluntarily improve soil under older tanks. Of those that replied, none had. Some fixes have been made to other parts of their operations. We asked for a tour. The oil companies would not give us one.
Where would I grade them? I would give them a strong F+.
Losing the tank farm could be the greatest threat to Oregon's post-earthquake recovery. Oregon has no backup fuel supply, and damage to pipelines, highways, and railroads across the Northwest will make it hard to get fuel from elsewhere.
I would say that in general, the fuel that you have in your own car is what you'll have for probably many, many weeks. So without fuel, we're flat on our backs.
Scientists say there is a 1 in 3 chance that Cascadia will strike within 50 years. When it happens, the consequences will be felt across the Northwest. But perhaps nowhere more than in the Oregon community of Seaside.
The earthquake threat, the tsunami threat, and then it's all of the people, all the buildings that are vulnerable. When you add those two together, that's how you really define risk. And so I would say Seaside would be the highest concentration of risk for the Oregon coast.
Seaside residents are hemmed in between the ocean and the Nicanicum River, with only a few old bridges standing between town and safety.
It's going to make that initial evacuation somewhat challenging.
Jay worries that residents here think Cascadia will generate a tsunami like the one that hit towns from Seaside to Crescent City, California, after the 1964 Alaskan earthquake. A Cascadia tsunami would be thousands of times more destructive.
Oregon now really looks to Japan from the 2011 event as probably the best teaching tool we've got.
Jay sees parallels between Seaside and the Japanese town of Minami-Sanriku, a town that used to look like this. Shinichi Sato captured the former beauty of Minami-Sanriku in photos. But on March 11, 2011, he watched through his lens as his town was washed away.
This is a place where I evacuated and took the first photograph. My eye caught the largest number of people at the Disaster Prevention Center. I saw roughly 20 people standing on the roof. I was afraid they might not be able to escape.
Shinichi lost many friends and a town he loved that day. But he says many people died because they sought high ground based on what they knew from past tsunamis. It was not high enough. New tsunami maps in Oregon paint a more realistic picture of a Cascadia tsunami, which could reach more than 70 feet high in places. And Oregon has no evacuation shelters inside the tsunami zones.
At this point, it's all about high ground, about going to the hills to the east of the city and trying to get thousands of people mobilized within 20 to 30 minutes of time.
Jay hoped the new maps might help coastal cities plan better. But when one town decided to build a new hospital 4 blocks from the ocean, a battle over maps and state power put Jay's plan to the test.
The vibe in Gold Beach, I think, is just laid back. A lot of the people that live in Gold Beach have escaped larger places.
When Jody Fritz took the job of Gold Beach city manager, she inherited a town that was economically depressed and growing older.
When I was in high school in the 80s, we had a lot more younger people here, a lot more families. When your kids are little, you ask what are the schools like, but when you get older, it's like, what kind of health care do you have?
And that's where Gold Beach has a problem.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Curry County's one and only hospital sits about 4 blocks from the ocean. It was built in 1951 as a single-story, unreinforced brick building.
As you can see, this is an old building, and it has a lot of problems. Equipment storage in the hallways, no smoke or fire protection throughout the building, so if there were a fire, smoke would spread rapidly. We would have to evacuate the entire building, all our patients, all our staff. We would have no place to go. Seismically, this building would collapse in a heartbeat.
Conditions were so bad that the state fire marshal gave Curry General Hospital an ultimatum.
If we don't get it fixed by 2016, he's going to shut the building down. That's the long and short of it. And then where do you go for health care? It's over an hour to the next closest facility.
Residents in this cash-strapped region voted to pay for a new hospital. Officials decided to build it exactly where the old one stands.
When I was called and I was told that they were replacing an existing hospital in the same location, no, I was so disappointed. I was, crestfallen that, it's just like, what? Why? What have we all been working for and this is happening? I'm using this example with this newly proposed hospital in Gold Beach that is going in. It's the kind of missed opportunity that we can't afford to let happen again here in the state. Next slide.
Jay pleaded with the legislature and local officials to get them to reconsider the hospital's plans, because he'd seen that there was another way. Ishinomaki Red Cross Hospital in Japan took the full brunt of a magnitude 9 earthquake. But the hospital survived without so much as a broken window. That's because the hospital was built on a hill beyond the tsunami zone. And during the quake, the entire building floated on a cushion of springs. Jay toured the hospital with Dr. Chris Goldfinger and Allison Perch. This was seismic engineering unlike anything they'd seen in Oregon.
So, can you explain the system to me?
Inside, there is a rubber isolator which consists of 26 layers of rubber and iron sheet. It is structured to prevent the hospital from getting damaged in the earthquake by suppressing the vertical shaking and shaking sideways.
Base isolation is now in wide use across Japan, but in the U.S., it's California that's taking the lead. Engineers at UC San Diego built this mock hospital to California's highest seismic standards, but then they tested it with and without base isolation. With base isolation, the hospital rolled through even the most violent motions. Without base isolation, the building stands, but the damage is severe. Base isolation is expensive, and in Oregon, it's not required in hospitals, even in earthquake zones. Jay insists it's a model for the future.
The payoff for that big hospital in Shinomaki is it worked. It continued to deliver in the worst case scenario because they built it above and beyond the minimum codes.
But in Gold Beach, there's still the fight about where the new hospital will go. Local officials used 20-year-old tsunami maps to conclude the hospital is beyond danger. The state says new maps, based on the latest science, reveal a much greater threat. And there's another problem.
It's going! Get everybody out of the way! It's going! The whole thing going!
Landslides. Everything in red here is land the state says could slide during a Cascadia quake.
There's a reason why Gold Beach isn't up on the hills, because those hills are geologically unstable.
With money, land and buildings can be engineered to withstand even big quakes. But in Oregon, no one is offering money.
Unfunded mandates are, in my opinion, ridiculous. It's like, what's the point of coming up with a plan if you don't have a way to implement the plan? If the state wants to talk about resiliency, then they need to pony up the cash.
Curry General Hospital was the first big test of whether state seismic plans had any teeth. But a move to give the state more power to regulate development in the tsunami zone failed, killing any chance of moving the hospital.
We need to get on with our lives, and that means we need to replace our hospital.
In May of 2015, Curry General broke ground on its new hospital. It meets current seismic codes, but it remains inside the new tsunami zone. The last Cascadia quake happened 100 years before Lewis and Clark landed in Oregon. Since then, millions have come to live and work in buildings that were constructed before anyone knew that another quake was coming. It's something engineer Yume Wang thinks about every day as she makes her way to her Portland office, passing building after building made of brick.
When I walk around here, I see a lot of beautiful historic buildings like anyone else. But I also, as an engineer, see the hazards associated with it.
Yume helped write Oregon's resilience plan. It estimates 24,000 buildings will be destroyed and another 85,000 severely damaged statewide. Many of those will be unreinforced masonry buildings like this one.
I actually personally wouldn't work in this building. This type of construction can withstand vertical forces very well, so gravity loads, snow loads, but it cannot take earthquake shaking. It tends to break apart very easily.
This two-story brick building in New Zealand was brought down in just 5 seconds. It's one of more than 500 masonry buildings reduced to rubble after a violent but relatively small 6.3 magnitude quake.
Brittle buildings fail. People freak out because this is, possibly going to be the biggest thing that has happened in their lives.
Yume spent years investigating the risk. In Portland, the inventory of unreinforced brick buildings, or URMs, is massive. Everything here in red is a URM built without seismic reinforcement. If it was constructed before 1993 and hasn't been renovated, it's not designed for a Cascadia earthquake. That's over 1,700 buildings in Portland alone.
This is the type of area where the entire
area could be closed after an earthquake because of so many destroyed and damaged buildings.
It's a problem that extends far beyond Portland. UMay is frustrated that these problems can be fixed, but often aren't.
From an engineering standpoint, it's very possible to fix all the unreinforced masonry buildings. You can add cross bracing to withstand lateral shaking. Sometimes you can see anchor plates tying the wall and the floors together. If you don't have them, then the shaking can peel the wall off.
In Oregon, seismic retrofitting is not required, and few owners voluntarily spend money to make their old buildings quake-proof.
There will be a lot to fix after a major earthquake, regardless of how prepared we are. But if there is so much that we have to fix, if we have too much damage, we risk never recovering.
What about Oregon's children? How safe are they in the schools we send them to every day?
Nice work, everybody. Some good drop cover and hold on. As soon as we think the shaking stops is when we go outside.
When Amy Kleiner became principal of Sunnyside Environmental School, she learned that schools were largely on their own when it comes to seismic preparedness.
I'm from Oregon. I'm born and raised here. It has always been on my mind in that I've always known that we've lived along the Cascadia subduction zone, and that I've known since I was a child that Portland has experienced large magnitude 9+ earthquakes in its history. But once I had kids and then became responsible for all these kids is when I really started to think about, well, what can we do here as a school to be more prepared?
Oregon law requires schools to run regular quake drills. At a minimum, kids learn to drop, cover, and hold on. But Amy requires more. Students have to create emergency plans with their families. Amy recruited engineers to help her find new evacuation routes to avoid the riskiest parts of the building. And it was Amy, along with Sunnyside parents, not the school district, that raised money to reinforce brickwork over doorways.
The earthquake drills are practiced in California schools once a month, and all kids know that earthquakes are a huge risk if they're living in Los Angeles or San Francisco. So it is frustrating that there's a large population in Oregon that doesn't even realize that we live in an earthquake zone. So all I can control is my own family, my own school. So that's what we try to impact.
1,000 Oregon schools are at risk of at least partial collapse in an earthquake. California has been seismically upgrading schools since 1933. Oregon only recently dedicated $115 million to retrofit schools in danger. But the list of schools needing work is long, and Sunnyside Environmental has to wait its turn.
So this is the science room. Last year we came up here and things looked a lot different.
Dana Buell was one parent who decided not to wait for government help.
There was a lot more stuff on top of these shelves, and none of the shelves were attached to the walls. So there's this Velcro strap. It's enough to keep it from falling. And we put these latches on so that the doors won't fly open. More people are hurt or killed by falling objects in an earthquake than by buildings collapsing. You know, it's the light coming down and hitting somebody on the head or the bookshelf or, pinning them. So this is our emergency bucket, and there are basic emergency supplies. There are rosters for every classroom in the bucket.
Good job, Heather's class.
These are small steps Sunnyside parents and teachers are taking right now. But many Oregon schools aren't even doing this.
We've all inherited this situation together, and we need each other to get it done, and to just expect that the school district or any other government agency is going to fix it for us is really, that's the head in the sand approach, I think.
On the other side of the state, Doug Doherty's Seaside School District faces a double whammy.
We are in probably one of the most dangerous places in Oregon to have schools.
But when it came to finding a new home for Seaside's aging schools, Doug ran into a problem. As recently as the 1990s, no one knew how high was high enough to get out of the path of a tsunami. Doug asked Rob Witter, a geologist for the USGS, to find out. Rob probed into the hills above Seaside and Cannon Beach, and he found a story in the sand that revealed Oregon's violent past.
So that tsunami came in and it crashed through the forest. It carried beach sand with it, and it towered above our heads almost 2 stories. It flooded the entire valley.
The evidence came in core after core of soil. The geologic layers Rob saw read like pages in a book.
We were able to find sand 1,000 years old deposited over a mile from the mouth of Ecola Creek. That's evidence that an ancient tsunami that inundated this valley 1,000 years ago flooded all the way up to this point.
I remember clearly a phone call that basically said, Doug, we're finding things here we had no idea about.
For Doug, there was only one thing to do.
We need to move our schools at least 80 to 100 feet in elevation to be safe.
At that time, a tsunami that big was hard for Seaside residents to fathom. But then, Japan happened.
I really wanted to take you to this point because you get an overview of the entire Togura Bay and see how much damage that the tsunami actually brought.
Dr. Chris Goldfinger, Jay Wilson, and Allison Perch joined Soshu Mitsunaga on a hill above the remains of the Japanese town of Minami Senriku. Residents knew all about tsunamis. They'd experienced several in the last century. But they thought their schools were safe.
Actually, the tsunami reached where we're standing right here.
Wow. I'm looking straight down on these cars. They're probably 70 or 80 feet below us at least, maybe a bit more, and then maybe another 10 or 20 feet down to the water surface. If you were at a place like this on the Oregon coast, you'd feel pretty safe. We're on top of a hill here. We're probably, I'm not sure, maybe 20 to 25 meters above the water right now. But where we stood right here on this berm was underwater. It was over my head right here, and there's a school behind us that was inundated to the first floor.
The similarities between Seaside and coastal Japan were so close, the geologic evidence so solid, that Doug felt his case for moving Seaside schools was a slam dunk.
It is a beautiful place to live. It's a beautiful place for people from all over to visit. Unfortunately, it's someday literally going to be a disaster area.
Doug's challenge was convincing residents to relocate all 4 Seaside schools to high ground. Price tag, $128 million.
We had so much community buy-in from our focus groups. The survey came back. There is a 70% chance that this will pass, and unfortunately, it did not pass.
Doug's plan may have been undermined by simple demographics. Polls showed local support, but only a third of local homes are owner-occupied. Nearly 2/3 are owned by non-residents who may have balked at an increase in property taxes for vacation homes and rentals.
I don't know. I'm at a point where we're all very frustrated. We know we need this to happen as soon as possible, but we don't know what it would take.
Today, all but one of Seaside District schools remain within the tsunami zone. Tragic stories from the Japan tsunami are easy to find even years later. But Dr. Chris Goldfinger, Jay Wilson, and Allison Perch found one unexpected success story that played out here at Sendai Airport. An airport that looked like this just 3 years earlier.
The earthquake happened at 2:46 p.m. The first wave of the tsunami reached here nearly 70 minutes later. I clearly saw the white splash of water over there as the tsunami was approaching. It is 17 meters tall at the third floor level. Tsunami water came up to the height of the ceiling on the first floor. 1,700 people came to evacuate. Those 1,700 people ended up being completely stranded.
What the world saw at Sendai Airport on March 11th looked like the end of the world. The kind of thing no one could prepare for.
The tsunami covered the entire runway, and this area also had debris piled up here.
Sendai Airport was only 80 miles from the epicenter. It sustained damage, but it wasn't destroyed. That's because engineers had learned from the massive Kobe earthquake of 1995. After Kobe, Japan launched a program to reinforce bridges, airports, and runways nationwide.
It is possible that had a liquefaction occurred, there would have been a big crack. The ground could have become wavy and aircraft could not have been able to fly in and out for a while.
These small holes are the only sign of injection grouting, one of several techno-fixes that saved Sendai Airport. It took time to clear the tsunami debris, but within days, relief flights could bring in food, medical supplies, and other help. After only 4 weeks, commercial flights returned. The airport survived because it had been seismically designed before the Tohoku quake.
So one of the things I noticed when I walked in was this is a pretty cool design. I haven't seen it before. When an earthquake happens, the glass can move separately from the structure. And then here you have flexible caulking, so there's nothing rigid so that the glass actually doesn't have any additional stresses during an earthquake.
Portland International Airport has none of these features. It was built on some of the poorest soil in Oregon. Its runways are not reinforced. Oregon's ability to recover after an earthquake will be in jeopardy if the state's biggest airport goes down.
The main takeaway from this is that they needed the airports for their emergency response and recovery. The big test happened within a couple of years of when they did it, so it proved that it worked, and they were able to get up and going.
Oregon has been slow to reinforce its infrastructure. We're far behind Washington and California in preparing for Cascadia, especially when it comes to bridges.
What freaks me out the most when I think bridges and infrastructure in Oregon is not actually the infrastructure. What freaks me out the most is the fact that our public has no real concept of how ugly it's going to be after a 9.0 Cascadia quake.
Nearly 1,000 bridges across Oregon could collapse or be heavily damaged in a Cascadia quake. 130 bridges along the coast are expected to be destroyed. Engineers expect Portland's Broadway, Burnside, Morrison, and Hawthorne bridges to come down. And thousands of Oregon overpasses balance on weak concrete supports, the kind that failed under freeways during San Francisco's Loma Prieta quake.
That's where the shelf is. So the girder was just sitting up on that 8 inches.
In Portland, Allison has come to see one bridge that's a step in the right direction. The Selwood used to be among Oregon's worst bridges. Ian Cannon says it's being rebuilt with earthquakes in mind, to a point.
The design for this is to remain elastic in what we call the 500-year earthquake. So it should perform pretty well, but we can't always promise that it's going to be as good as new and perfect after that big earthquake.
New Oregon bridges have to be built so they don't collapse. The Selwood is designed so that it probably will be up and running a few days after a quake. But Allison says that in general, the rules allow more wiggle room than the public might think.
American codes and actually some international codes consider life safety as the design minimum. So it won't fall down, you can survive on it, but you might not be able to use it after the earthquake.
That's a far cry from what Allison saw across Japan, where even simple overpasses like this one are base isolated and can handle magnitude 9 earthquakes.
Japan takes that to another step and considers immediate occupancy or immediate use. So yes, nobody's going to die on it, but you're also going to be able to drive over it afterwards.
Even TriMet's new Tilikum crossing over the Willamette is a compromise. The bridge should survive Cascadia, but the approaches leading to it may not, because strengthening the soil under them would have cost up to $200 million more. And that's the new bridge. Oregon only budgets enough to replace 1 or 2 bridges a year. But there are 2,700 aging bridges in the state highway system. Nearly half were built before 1970. Washington has upgraded 4 times as many bridges as Oregon. California, 35 times as many.
We had about a 5.0 occur on the Portland Hills Fault.
If bridges collapse, schools are flattened, hospitals stop functioning, and the airport stops working, what then?
Collapse, partial collapse.
In Portland, drills like this reveal the limitations of government in a worst-case disaster.
We know that we don't have enough police and fire personnel to respond to everyone in the city that needs help.
We're not like California or Florida. You know, Florida has hurricanes all the time. We don't have disasters that happen on a regular basis.
In the event of a real earthquake, we get dispatched to go out to do a rapid evaluation of all the bridge structures within the city.
We're going to close this bridge.
People need to understand that they will be on their own for more than just 3 days, in some cases up to 2 weeks, if not longer.
If Oregon had an early warning system like Japan, residents could at least be given several minutes to seek safety before the shaking starts. But a system now being tested for Oregon and Washington is years away from implementation. If Cascadia happens tomorrow, there will be no warning.
I don't sleep well at night. We're playing catch-up. We're not as prepared as San Francisco, Los Angeles.
That's one reason FEMA thinks that after Cascadia, refugees from hard-hit Western Oregon may just head east.
The Oregon Resilience Report identifies Redmond as a primary recovery site for the state of Oregon. So that got my attention. And I went, what are we doing about this? If we're identified, what plans have we made? Well, guess what? We hadn't made any.
Redmond Mayor George Endicott was relieved to learn Eastern Oregon should expect only moderate damage from Cascadia. But then FEMA told him to prepare to take in a staggering number of refugees from Western Oregon.
The fairgrounds, you can see behind us over here, all those buildings, they say they can handle about 20,000 people. Unfortunately, we're being told the prediction is about 100,000 minimum. Some numbers go as high as 1 million people.
Redmond is attractive because it has a beefed-up airport, space for refugee camps, and a highway that could replace a battered I-5. In other words, Redmond could become the new Salem or Portland after a quake. 30 years ago, no one was talking this way, but now we know the earthquake is coming. So what can we do to prepare ourselves?
Here's my go bag that I keep in my truck and take with me everywhere.
Patrick Corcoran is ready for Cascadia. He happily lives on the coast, but he always carries what he needs to leave on a moment's notice.
What I have in here is a lot of my old camping stuff. Here is some nice rainwear with some fleece inside and some pants, some boots. Next most important is water. I have pure water. I have a warm body. That's 3 days right there. Yes, there's a danger. There is a bit of fear, but that fear can be transmuted into preparedness.
And Pat says that's exactly what he's starting to see.
This ride is intended to simulate a supply run for their local neighborhood.
Disaster relief trials now take place in cities from Portland to Eugene to San Francisco. These volunteer exercises build on lessons from Hurricane Katrina and Superstorm Sandy, where neighbors with bikes proved indispensable.
Do you have a cargo bike? What does your neighbor need? This might be a shortcut around a pile of rubble. This might be the easy route in a disaster.
When a disaster comes and you can step up to the plate and help out, that's going to be where the rubber really meets the road.
On the coast, where tsunami signs used to be considered bad for business, tourists now flock to an annual race to high ground.
Thank you for joining us today for Race the Way. We are
always think of it ahead of time when you're heading to the beach. Know where to go.
Oregonians face big decisions about what to build, how much to spend, and how seriously we prepare ourselves at home, in school, and in the places we work. For Kate Raphael, the 2010 earthquake her family experienced in Chile was a wake-up call.
You can prepare for the weeks that follow, because I can guarantee you, our cell phones will go down and all the grocery stores will remain closed and there will be no electricity. And so I can guarantee you that all of the systems that we take for granted will be completely non-functional. So we can create a store of food. We can create a store of water. We can prepare for specific things in the aftermath when we will all have to be self-reliant.
From a geologic standpoint, this is an imminent threat. It's really a race against time. We're good right now because we haven't been hit yet, but we will have wished we've done more when we get hit because it's inevitable.
The lasting lesson from Japan is that megaquakes are bad, but they're not the apocalypse. And it doesn't have to be that way in Oregon either.
Japan is a great example of how an earthquake like this, as bad as it is survivable. And to just throw up your hands and say we're all going to die is wrong.
Cascadia's potential and its risks are no longer a mystery. It's no longer a question of whether it will happen. From here on out, it's only a question of what we do about it.
Don't let this overwhelm your life and overly cloud your life. But to have it be something that we know about, something that we've internalized, part of our being, like rain. We know to wear rain jackets even though the sun might be coming out.
Oregon is a beautiful place. It's not going to be so beautiful after this earthquake, and we want to get it back to that as soon as we possibly can. And I don't think